Hello and welcome to the 8th webinar for the NSCF Collection Management course. It feels like it's been a while, so good to have you guys here. I see we're at 47 people, so welcome everyone. Before we get started, I just want to I'll be introducing Michelle, who will be running this webinar today. We are focused today on the collection and curation policies, and Michelle will be running the show today, and she'll be doing that alone. For the next slide, before we get to Michelle, let's just get to the guidelines for the webinar. So some rules of engagement for us, just so that everyone knows how to behave, how to hold themselves, and what to do. So we would like you to keep your contributions helpful and considerate of everyone. That means the hosts as well as other participants. And you can use the chat box. I see you haven't forgotten. So there's a few people who have started greeting everyone in the chat box. So please use that to say hello and let us know which institution you are joining us from. I see who got us started. Nikisha got us started, and she's from the Skukuza Iberium. We have Chantal Gergen, we have Kululwa, Daniela, Lizzle, Davi, Jermaine, Louis, and I'm sure the others will be putting in their greetings as we speak. So continue doing that as we go on. It's just good manners. It's African manners for you to get to a place and say good morning or whatever greeting you want to say. So let's get that going. You can also use the chat box below to put your questions. So whatever question comes to mind regarding the webinar, regarding the content of the webinar, please put that in the Q&A box. Don't put it in the chat box, because in the chat box, there's a lot of communication going on and we can lose that. We can, it's possible that we won't see it, but in the Q&A box, we will see it definitely. So please use that for your questions. If we don't get to answering some of your questions that you'll be adding during the webinar, we will try to make sure that we answer those, especially if you also put them in the webinar link. So by the webinar link, we mean we're going to post this webinar, the recording, on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, Natural Science Collections Facility. And we are also live on Facebook, so we'll also be able to answer questions from there. So you can also visit our website, nscf.org.za, go to resources and then collections management for more information on collections management, the course and the manual. So now we can get started. I'll hand over to Michelle.
Thanks very much, Fulu, for the introduction and background, and welcome everybody to the webinar this morning. As Fulu says, it feels like it's been quite a long time since we've had one of these webinars. And I think just before we get started, just to send our best wishes to the people in Durban area where they've had very severe flooding. I'm sure you've all seen it on TV, and our thoughts are really with all of you, and we hope that you and your families are safe. We understand that it must be a very difficult situation at this time, so we are thinking of you. Okay, let's get started with the webinar. So what we're talking about today is the collection management and curation. Well, it's really the curation or collection care policy that institutions that hold collections should have. And really what we're talking about here are addressing these 10 agents of deterioration and loss for collections. So we've talked about these in previous webinars, and these are all agents that can have a negative impact on collections. And so this is the focus. So we're not talking about other aspects of collection management, just really looking after, caring for the collections. When we talk about a policy, we're really talking about the rules that must be followed to achieve the mission or the objectives of the institution. So you need to think about what is the mission or objectives or aim of your institution. So if there's something in your vision and mission and objectives regarding looking after a collection, and protecting it for future generations, doing research on collections, then you really should have a policy to ensure that that's achieved. So when we say that a policy is rules, if you've got a policy for something, the policy statements have to be implemented. So it is rules. Also the value. So a lot of collection institutions, most institutions have a vision and they have a mission and they also have values. And so these are kind of their principles that guide their behavior and what they do. So you have to think about what are your institution's values. And again, your policy needs to align with what your values are. And professionalism, excellence, accountability, transparency, best practice, these are very common values. And so the policy should really reflect that. So if your policy is best practice, if your value is best practice, your policy should comply or align with that. Just to say that when we did the collections assessment in 2011, through the NRF, so they commissioned an assessment of all the natural science collections in the country. And most institutions did not have a collection management and curation policy. Or if they did, then it wasn't used or it wasn't known about by most of the staff. So just this wasn't the full set of collections we assessed, but 58 that I did. 38 of the staff responsible for those collections did not know if there was a formal policy. And only 13 of 58 said that they did have a policy. So you can see that there was a big gap. There were also very few SOPs or standards documents for curation back in 2010, 2011. 50 of the 58 collections did not have guidelines for checking and inspecting the collections. And some institutions did have guidelines and procedures, but again, these were not implemented or were implemented by some staff and not others, or some parts were implemented, but not others. So the whole sort of policy SOP environment back then, more than 10 years ago now, was not strong. I don't know whether the situation has changed since then. I think that there has been a move towards formally documenting things. But if there are policies, are they aligned with global best practice? So I think often the tendency is to put what you currently do into your policy rather than putting what you should be doing into your policy. What's covered in a collection care policy? So this is a big question. What do you put in it? You've got maybe lots of SOPs and lots of small policies. So what goes into a collection care or curation policy? How is that different from all those other things that we could have? In the manual, and if you look at the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections, you look on their website and in their documents, you'll see there's 4 high-level statements about collection care. So collection objects must be protected against unnecessary damage, loss, or alteration that might affect future research potential. Collection management and care should meet the highest professional standards. It must be compatible with and enhance access to the collections for intended scientific and education uses of the collection objects. Every effort must be made to minimize the level of risk facing collection objects as a result of storage and use. And generally, the preferred approach for research collection objects will involve preventative conservation. So what that means is rather than fixing things once they've been damaged, you put in place actions or measures to prevent damage. So these are high-level statements, and they're quite hard to really know what it's telling you to do. They're kind of high-level principles, which is important. So these can be kind of overarching high-level statements. In the NACF manual, there are policy guideline statements, and these are much more detailed that would allow those 4 high-level statements to be kind of translated into more concrete things. So not all of those 40 that are listed in the manual are relevant to all types of collections. Some of them can be consolidated, and in the webinar today, we're going to focus on what I think are the most critical 26 of the 40. I have consolidated some. So just to point out that these top 26 or these policy guideline statements don't deal with things about access, so they don't deal with loans and visitors. They don't deal with accessions or deaccessions. Data management, ethics, collection documentation. So those are separate policies. They're not specific about collection care. So remember that policy statements are the rules. So that's what I said at the beginning. In the manual, it's guidelines for those statements. So the NACF doesn't make the policies, doesn't say these are the policies, because each institution will have their own policies. So all the manual does is it gives guidelines for the policy statements. But once you have a policy for your institution, it is a rule. So policy must not include detailed standards or procedures. So you often see that there's a mixture. So policy will start saying how you must do things, and it shouldn't be. It should be something that's quite short. And you'll have a whole lot of other documents that will be the SOPs or your standards or your workflows. So also just an important point is that the guideline statements in the manual were not made up by the NACF or the Collection Management and Curation Working Group. They didn't just come up with these. They really are based on global best practice. So this isn't, so you can't say why did the working group or who said we must do this. There's been lots of reading and review of documents. So what are these rules about? So they really, one of the big things is about storage, and that's your storage environment, your cabinets, your shelving, the containers, rules about what you must and must not do in the collection storeroom, rules about protecting the collections from drying out or being eaten by pests. And I think that it's those 2 things, because those are the biggest risks outside of the storage and environmental issues. So if you've got wet collections, having them drying out or at the wrong level of preservative, concentration of preservative, or if you've got skins or bones or pinned insects, then pests are a massive problem. So those two areas. It's rules about organizing the collections and knowing where every object is. So if you've got, losing specimens or objects is a big risk, or just having chaos when you've got millions of objects in your collection, it can be a real disaster. Rules about maintaining the information associated with each of the objects. So without that, your collection has no value. And rules about having trained people working in the collections. So these are really a set of rules that cover everything to do with looking after the collections on site. It's not about other aspects. It's about caring for the collections and protecting them. So let's get started with what are these top 26. It's quite a long thing to work through, but we'll include some polls just to get people to reflect. So the first rule is that a collection department or institution shall obtain or accept donations of collection material that requires facilities or resources beyond the institution's allocated budget for the management and preservation of the collection. So that's quite a mouthful, but it basically means that if you can't care for the material, you can't accept it. So if you don't have budget and you don't have staff to be able to care for it properly, then you should not accept it. And it also means that if you don't have enough storage space and the right storage facilities, and you don't have the staff to curate existing collections, you must not collect more material for those collections. So I know this is a very contentious issue. Me, like everybody else who works in this area, we love doing field work and we love collecting. And while backlogs build up and build up, we're out all summer collecting more material. And it becomes a massive problem. So that should be a policy statement, that if you can't pay for it, you may be able to collect, but it will have to go somewhere else. You'll have to find an institution that can look after the material. Collection storage rules. So this is obviously very important, how we store these collections. So collection objects must be stored and displayed only in the conditions suitable for their preservation. So it should be pest-free, correct relative humidity and temperature, and you should use archival, curation appropriate materials. The third one, collection storage areas must be used only for storing collections. And I know that this is also difficult, and it's also a contentious point. Collection storage areas must not be used for office space, laboratory space, storage of chemicals or consumables. So this is the global standard. This is what the global practice recommends. Best practice is that this is what is how you do it. The fourth one, collection cabinets, shelving units, and other storage equipment must be arranged so that access to the collection objects is not obstructed. So you shouldn't have to move things out of the way to access something. You shouldn't have to have to crawl into areas to try and get things out of cupboards. It should be quite easily accessible, and that's so that you can inspect and clean things properly. The fifth one, storage area must provide adequate space to accommodate reasonable growth of the collection over the next 10 years. So that's a problem for some collections, they're full. So these are about the storage rules. So if you meet these, you're doing very well. And we're going to do a quick poll now. We'll set up a poll. And let's just see, because you might be thinking, this is impossible. Nobody does these things. Let's see. Maybe some institutions do, and maybe everybody's thinking, well, everyone does this. So let's get a sense. And of course, it's anonymous. So we're not trying to catch anybody out, but let's just get a sense. So the first one, does anyone sit and work in your collection storage area? Yes or no? Are there chemicals or consumables, bottles, cardboard boxes, whatever else, stored with the collections in the same collection room? Yes or no? Do researchers examine specimens in the storage areas? Yes or no? And is your collection storeroom full? Yes, almost. No. Okay, so there's the poll, and it shouldn't take more than 30 seconds for you to do it. So we've got a question as well. Does cataloging specimens, adding catalog numbers and capturing data in the collection room count as sitting and working? So if you're doing data capture, yes, I'd say that does. Cataloging specimens, adding, so obviously if you're putting the catalog numbers into or onto the specimens, then that would probably be fine. But if you're sitting doing data capture, that is working. So the kind of, the way that it should work is that you should have a workspace adjoining your collection storeroom. You take the material out and you go and sit outside of the actual collection room. And, one of the reasons for this is that Ideally, these collection rooms should be cold. They should be kept cold and they should be kept relatively sterile and sealed off. And that's quite an unhealthy environment to spend any length of time in. So apart from just having the risk of somebody moving things and bumping things, it's also quite difficult for somebody to work in, if the conditions are the way they should be. Okay, so let's have a look. So does anyone sit and work in your collection storeroom? So this is quite interesting. It's almost split, but 60% almost say no. So nobody sits in there and works, which is great. The second one, are there chemicals or consumables stored with the collections? That's brilliant. 77% said no, which is really positive. Do researchers examine specimens in the storage area? No. So that's 66%. And then is your collection room full? Yes, so 14%. So this is a challenge. Almost 53%, so that's also high. And no, 32%. So what it means is start thinking about and planning already these 55% and 14% need a plan already. So this is positive. It looks good, and it means that it's not, as a whole, the collections in the country are not going to find this too difficult to implement something like this as a policy. All right, thank you for that input. I think it's good to see where we at. So the sixth policy, or the sixth rule that you should have, is that collection storage areas must be kept sealed off from external exposure as far as possible. The doors and any windows should be kept closed at all times, and any other openings well sealed. So this is also a challenge if you've got people working in the collection storeroom, for them to not be able to open the windows or keep doors open. But it's important to keep these openings sealed because it protects the collection from pests, from dust, and from temperature fluctuations. The seventh one, the collection storage areas must have appropriate fire detection and control systems that are tested and maintained regularly. Storage cabinets should be constructed of fireproof material, and if that's not possible, at least there should be fire doors for the collection storage areas. The eighth one, fluid preserved collection objects must be housed separately, so in a separate room or a separate area from the dry preserved collections, and have appropriate ventilation and fire protection. So it's just that it's an additional risk to have ethanol specimens stored where you've got very easily burnt dried materials. So this, I think most institutions have these rules. So no eating, drinking, or smoking. Obviously no smoking in the collection storage areas. No living organic material to be brought to the collection storeroom. So you can't have all your little pot plants on the windowsill of your collection storeroom. Shouldn't have old coffee mugs with a very healthy culture of mold growing in it. And then also no children. So unless they're on supervised education tours, no children should be allowed into the collection storeroom. And also no pets should be allowed into the collection storeroom. I think those are quite easy to have as rules. Okay, then what about pests and drying art? So this may not be relevant for all collection types, but for some certainly. All collection items that are brought in, so either newly acquired material or returning loan material, or material that you've loaned, or material that's brought in for identification, it must be free of pests. And so you should treat it before it goes anywhere near your main collection, whether that treatment is freezing or some other kind of fumigation. The 13th one is very important. So a policy statement or a rule should be that there must be routine documented monitoring or checking system for pests and preservative concentration levels. And it must be carried out according to the SOPs or best practice guidelines, and it must be documented. The 14th one is that collections must be treated for pest management control eradication as required by the SOPs or your guidelines. So if you must follow a procedure for managing pests, and then wet collections must be topped up and or preservative concentrations adjusted and faulty containers replaced according to your SOPs or best practice guidelines. So those are really just rules about managing pests and managing drying out or the wrong concentration for wet collections. So let's just do another quick poll here just to get people to think about these 4 rules or policy statements. So do you have a regular schedule for checking pests or preservative levels? Yes or no? Do you keep records, so written documented records on file for these checks? Yes or no? And if you do these checks, how often do you do them? Every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, more than 1 year apart, never. So there's 3 questions. Okay, there are answers. So do you have a regular schedule for checking pests or preservative level? So 66% said yes, they do. And then the second one, do you keep records of these checks? 53% said yes. So there's quite a lot that needs to be done there to keep records. 47% no. And then how often do you do these checks? So every 3 months, that's nearly 40%, so that's very good. Every 6 months, that's 13, so that's still okay. About once a year, 16%, more than once a year, 21%. And I assume that it's because there's staffing constraints. I think that will be a challenge for some institutions, and then never is 11%. And maybe it's because it's not relevant to that collection type. So maybe paleontology fossils, you obviously don't need to check your preservative levels, and maybe pests are really not an issue in a paleontology collection. Okay, so that's very interesting. So obviously when we start looking at the details of pest control and dealing with and looking after wet collections, we'll talk more about how you can do this monitoring or these checks and how you do it. How do you top up? How do you control pests? We'll be dealing with that in later sessions. Okay, thanks. Okay, so very important policy statements are around the information associated with the objects. So number 16, collection objects must be fully documented before they're incorporated into the collection or before they're removed from the collection. So that documentation must be in your hard copy accession register. They must have a proper label, and they must also be in the database. So what often happens is, because that's quite a lot of work, you build up backlogs of objects that are waiting to be documented before they can come into the collection. And that creates another challenge, because that backlog of undocumented things can just grow and grow. We're going to do another poll. I think this is our last one. But I think it's also just important to think about this. So how many unaccessioned or undocumented objects do you have in your collection? None? More than, less than 50, so just a couple. 51 to 100, 101 to 500, 501 to 1,000, more than 1,000, too many to count, no idea. So these are kind of estimates, but let's get a sense. And then also, how long has there been this backlog of unaccessioned objects? So less than a year. So maybe you just got one massive consignment. Somebody donated something, so it's just been there for less than a year. Between 1 and 5 years, 6 to 10 years, more than 10 years. Ever since I've worked there, I have no idea. We have no backlog. So those are just 2 quick questions. Let's get some answers, some input from you. It'll be interesting to see. So let's have a look. So we've got 20% of institutions or collections, maybe it's collections, have no backlogs. And then another 7% have less than 50. Another 10% have quite a, not very many, up to 500, and then up to 1,000, another 12, more than 1,000 is 20%, too many to count, 5%, I have no idea, 17%. So very, very mixed bag. And then for the second question, how long has that backlog been there? So less than a year is 12, 1 to 5 years is another 12, 6 to 10, 7%. More than 10 years is 17%. Ever since I've worked there, another 17, I have no idea, 20%. And we have no backlog, 15%. So again, a wide spread, very, very wide, even sort of spread of backlogs and how long they've been there. So thank you for that. So we will talk more about backlogs later in the course, but I think that that's important just to think about. It's fine to say everything must be documented, but are you creating a big backlog? Okay, then number 17. So this one is maybe not as high priority, but it's going to become more and more important. So all historical data, scientific and conservation actions must be fully recorded or documented. And I think that this hasn't been done in the past. So, you know, if a specimen's been used for some particular study, if you've taken some material off of it for DNA analysis, if you've changed the preservative in it, if you've had to freeze it because it's had a pest infestation, all of that should be recorded. And I don't think that we have been doing that. Also to do with the information, number 22, both hard copy and electronic versions of records must be updated when the taxonomy or identity of a collection object changes through publication or when a collection object is re-identified by an expert, according to the SOPs and standards. So I think in the manual it says something about it that, you know, you must update the taxonomy, but I think that it's becoming more and more difficult for collection institutions to do this just because of staff challenges, capacity challenges. But if you are going to update something, if you do make those name changes or whatever changes to the taxonomy, then it must be done in both the hard copy and the electronic record. So don't just do it on the label and not update it in the database. But you should have SOPs and you should have a workflow and a procedure for doing this, for when you make those taxonomic updates. And in the manual, it also says that you must do all of this on the same day. So you mustn't make the change in the database one day and then the next day change the label and the next day change the accession register. You must do it all on the same day, and that's because otherwise it can become quite chaotic. The number 23 is that the catalog book and the accession registers must not be erased. Entries must not be erased. So, you know, whether you can rub it out, I don't know. But I know in the past, Tipex was a very, very big tool to use where there was ink entries and you could Tipex over it and write over it. That should never be done. You can make a note below or above the entry. about what has been changed, but you never delete from a hard copy record. And then when you're renewing labels, number 24, or numbering or correcting spelling errors. So when you're doing anything to the labels, you must never throw away the old label. It should be kept with the actual collection object. So also, I think what happens sometimes is people remove all the labels and put them into a file or something like that. But it's also not best practice to do that. So sometimes you'll see a specimen might have 3 or 4 labels because there have been changes. And that's the right practice, is to add labels. So the next set of points, number 18, organizing the collection. So this is also really important. The type material must be marked with a color code on its label denoting its status. So for red colored labels, for a primary type, yellow for a secondary type, but your types must be flagged with a color code. Then the collection must be arranged systematically at the higher taxonomic levels, or alphabetically by order and family, and alphabetically at genus and species level. So you might have your own arrangement, your own system that must be followed. And the approach to organization of the collection must be clearly documented. So that might be a separate SOP or even a separate plan or something like that, but it must be documented. How is this collection organized? And that's massively important when you have these collections that have millions and millions of specimens and very complex classification systems. It can become very messy, so it must be documented. Organization of the collection again, so unidentified material should be kept separately from identified material. It might be integrated at the taxonomic level to which it has been identified. So you might have a separate area for unidentified or it might be a higher taxonomic level, but it shouldn't, you can't integrate it properly if it's not identified to species level. And then number 21, the location of each collection object in the collection should be included in the collection database. So you should have which shelf, which drawer it is, some kind of coding system, and that must go into your database. And if you move anything, that must be documented. So you'll have to go to your database and you'll have to update it in the database when you've moved it. If you remove anything from a shelf to send on loan, you should also put in a slip there to say this is being taken away for loan. So at any time, if anybody asks you where any object is, you should be able to tell them. And that's a very, that should be a policy statement, a rule. So the people who work in the collection, and this should be a policy as well. So anybody who goes into that collection storeroom, whether it's your staff, your security guards, researchers, must be made aware of their responsibilities regarding the care and maintenance of the collections, whether on display or in storage. So anybody who could have some kind of impact on that collection should be taught and trained how to work around them, how to clean them, and what not to do. And then the last one, staff must be properly trained and comply with all procedures and standards to ensure that the collection items are protected against damage or deterioration. So there hasn't been a strong culture of proper training of people to work in the collections. I know that it's often passed down, you learn from somebody else. But what happens when there's not somebody else? People are appointed and they make up their own rules, or they do what they think is best, but it may not be. It can be very damaging to have people who are not specifically trained in curation, collection care, doing anything. And they also need to know what are the SOPs, what are the workflows, and ensure that they don't discard them and make up their own, that they do comply with them. I think there's this course, there are other courses, short courses, there's lots of books that give a lot of relevant information, and yeah, we need to maybe think about some kind of accreditation system for staffing. So I think having completed and passed this course that the NSCF is running, that will give quite a lot of weight as a train, for training. So those are the 26, and I think you'll accept that if you had to follow all of those rules, your collections would be safe. They would be well cared for. So these are just some questions to think about. Does your institution have a collection care or curation policy that includes these kinds of statements or rules? Are there any others that were not listed here? And you might want to put some of those into the Q&A or into the chat. Have we missed something that would be really critical as a rule? And then think about, if you had all of these 26 rules, to what extent do you meet it in your collection or your institution? It might be 0, it might be all the way up to 100%. If a statement isn't met, so if one of these rules isn't met, what are the obstacles or challenges that would have to be overcome to get it met? So what are the blockages there? Why couldn't you have it? And are these obstacles within the control of the collection staff or the management or the institution, or outside of any of your control? And if that's the case, how would you deal with this? Can you just say, well, we can't do it, therefore we won't do it? Or do you try and do something else? If the obstacles are in the control of institutions, what is the plan to address these? So do you have a plan? If you have big backlogs, what is your plan? If you don't have a properly documented organization of the collection, what is your plan? So what needs to be done to comply with these policy statements? And what is the process or the plan for doing it? So you might have a whole list of things, and you need to prioritize, and you need to allocate budget, and you need to allocate staff. So this is a whole thing around curation planning, and we will be dealing with it at the end of the course or the webinar series later on in the year. Every institution should have not only a policy, but a curation plan documented that will help them shift from where they are to where they need to be compliant with their policy. And that's much more effective use of your staff and your budget, rather than having everybody running around doing ad hoc little things. There might be duplication, there might be things that fall through the cracks. You might be spending money on things that are not the priority. You might be spending staff time on things that are not the priority. So we will be looking at this curation planning. It's a really, really important part of collection care and management. Okay, so we're not going to spend time on these now. Next week, when we have the discussion forum, we will spend more time thinking about some of these questions. So yeah, just to say that what we've done today is really just a high-level policy statement about each area of work. The next topic, so next month, we're looking in more detail at collection storage and collection organization. And then in June, environmental conditions for collections. So that will be things like bottles and boxes and shelving and cabinets and humidity and temperature and storerooms. And then in July, we'll be focusing on the wet collections and how you should care for those, and doing topping up and adjusting ethanol concentrations. And then in August, we'll be looking at pest management for dryer collections. So monitoring pests and treating pests for different types of dryer collections. But just to say that, all we've done today is just made a statement, but there's a lot under that statement that needs to be addressed. So that's the end for today's webinar.